really there are two covenants going on in the world today. And one is people that make a covenant between God and themselves to live like by God's laws and rules. And the other is a covenant between people that make a covenant with themselves and with empire. And
Ooh.
that if you're a Christian, your job is to follow God and resist empire, like they did in the early church, and like really hasn't happened too much in the church since Constantine and since empire became wedded to Christianity.
Welcome to Practice Not Perfect, a podcast about practice that is rooted in the Christian spiritual tradition. I am your host, James Matichuk. In our contemporary world, one of the hardest things for us to be is hopeful. Violence, injustice, anxiety, war, they seem to be the rule of the day. But then there are those souls that help us see that another world is possible. Artists that paint a picture of a world that is better than our own. Poets that speak new worlds into being. Prophets that declare a coming kingdom. Activists who resist. I got to sit down with my friend Jackie, who is a prophetic activist and an artist, to talk about what it means for us to be hopeful and resisting empire. Here's our conversation. Hi, everybody. I'm here with my friend Jackie Allen-Ducot. She is a spiritual director. We did the same spiritual director certification program with the Center for Prophetic Imagination and Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing over the last couple of years. She also is a member of the Hartford Catholic Worker. And in that context, she's been involved with a lot of activism. She was part of the plowshare movement. She was mentored by people like the Berrigans, Daniel and Philip Berrigan and Elizabeth McAllister. And she is an artist. And I want to say from the start that she actually was the brainchild behind the logo I have for this podcast. And how that came about is I am somewhat of an artist too. I thought I'll do it myself, and I couldn't come up with an idea. And so I talked to my friend Jackie, and Jackie came up with this beautiful logo design. And then life was kind of harsh for you at the moment when that happened, because you had some siblings that were in the process of dying. And so I don't know that the logo ever came to the final form that we thought it would, but what I ended up being is I took your sketch, I added some color to it, and we put it up, and that's part of the ethos of this podcast, is that we practice even when it's not perfect or not necessarily what we envisioned, whatever comes out. So welcome, Jackie. That's a lot of talking right at the beginning. Welcome.
Thanks, James. It's good to be here with you and to see your smiling face again.
So I wanted to talk to you about how we practice hope. Right now, we're kind of in the Advent season, and these themes of hope and peace, they kind of are swirling in the air, so to speak. And as an artist and somebody who is involved in activism and protest, I think that you have a particular lens on that. But before we get into that part of our conversation, let me ask you my practice questions. So I do this at the start of every episode, but what is one thing that you have practiced a lot in your life? And when I say this, it doesn't have to be a big spiritual practice, but something that you've just done a lot of. Maybe it's a skill you mastered, a hobby you enjoy, an instrument you learned to play, whatever.
Oh, I would probably say drawing. I think I've been drawing since I could pick up a pencil or a stick or chalk or crayon. And I've loved to draw. And that's one thing I've never stopped doing my whole life. So even though I've had to stop and go with lots of other things because I'm on the ADD spectrum and I'm always going in a million directions.
It's wonderful. I can remember the first time I started drawing seriously. And my mother's an artist, so I never knew how to do stick men, like, stick people like some people did. I always drew people in, like, my early pictures. They all had bell bottoms because that's how you draw when you're a kid.
Mhm.
But uh, yeah, I mean, it's just always been a part of my life too.
Yeah.
Is there anything in your life that you've practiced in the past but you don't practice anymore?
Um, there's certainly lots of things I kind of stopped and started, but I started taking I loved my brother played the guitar and I loved it. And so I wanted to play the guitar and started taking lessons when I was in like fifth or sixth grade, I think. And I played the guitar quite a bit. And then for some reason, once I had kids, I stopped playing and I have not played since. But I have a son who plays by ear very well. He took violin, Suzuki violin in school when he was little, and plays the guitar fabulously, having never been taught or had a lesson, just taught himself. So I still enjoy guitar music a lot, but I never play anymore. Someday when I'm old.
Neat, neat. I play guitar, but not seriously for anything. I guess I do a little bit at church, and I do the music for my podcast, but that, like, it's not public right now.
Do you practice every day? Do you play every day?
I wouldn't say every day, but, like,
Most days?
most days. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
That you can see guitars on my wall behind me, and one of the reasons for that is if you don't put them away, you're more likely to play them. So
Mm-hmm. Mm.
if you put them in the case, then they're out of sight,
Yeah.
out of mind. But if you
Yeah.
you see a guitar, then you might pick it up and play it. So
Yep.
can I ask at the start here? Can you tell me a little bit about your faith background? Like, what was the church or religion you grew up in, and how has that kind of shaped where you are in the world now? So,
Sure. I think Irish Catholic. My mom and dad were both World War II vets that served overseas. My mom was an Army nurse, a MASH unit nurse, and they came home. She was from Brooklyn. He was from Hartford. And when they came home after the war, they got married and had 9 kids. And I was one. I was one of the youngest. So we went to our local St. Augustine's church faithfully. My parents were both kind of, in my eyes, kind of moral giants. And my mom and dad kind of perceived their experience in World War II pretty differently. My dad became a kind of a career Army guy, and he was in the reserves until he died. He was a lieutenant colonel. And my mom became a pacifist and was very anti-war because of all of the civilian death and horror and being in Italy after the war ended and seeing the carnage and all the starving kids. So it was a kind of an interesting upbringing. When my dad passed when I was in eighth grade, my mom became much more involved in anti-war stuff and really believed that the Gospels were called her to nonviolence. And she was very active in a group called Women of Faith and in Pax Christi. And so we were kind of raised under that understanding. And then when I was 20, I went to hear a talk by Phil Berrigan and Liz McAllister in a church with my mom in New Haven. And we kind of came out from that feeling like we would never be the same.
mm,
I think for me, it was jokingly referred to in high school as a teacher's nightmare, not because I behaved badly, but I loved to argue with the Christian ethics teachers. If the gospel says this about money and wealth, then why does the Pope sitting on all these riches in the Vatican? And if there's thou shalt not kill, then why does the church support the death penalty? And so I also was horrified by the Holocaust. I think in seventh grade, I might have read the prison diaries of Albert Speer and some horrible stuff. I just couldn't believe those things had happened and that people had let them happen. And I also, when I was in seventh grade and Sister Miriam taught us about mutually assured destruction, I was pretty rocked, like to the core of my being. And I would go home and say to my mother, how can this be true? Like, it really is mad. And I could never understand it. So when I went to hear the Berrigan speak, a lot of the things that really troubled my soul and my conscience were sort of met with, oh, here are the people that understand me. Here are the people that sort of are seeing the world as I see the world. And it completely sort of flipped this whole new lens on my theology for me. And it kind of, I think, two big things for me. One is that they really understood that liturgy and Eucharist were actions that were sacramental, but that had to be done in connection with the world and what was happening in the world. And that really there are two covenants going on in the world today. And one is people that make a covenant between God and themselves to live like by God's laws and rules. And the other is a covenant between people that make a covenant with themselves and with empire. And
Ooh.
that if you're a Christian, your job is to follow God and resist empire, like they did in the early church, and like really hasn't happened too much in the church since Constantine and since empire became wedded to Christianity. So that was some pretty heavy stuff, and it really resonated with me. And so through them, that's how I kind of became involved more in my activism.
Awesome. Wow, there's so much in there, and you kind of parlayed into my next question, but that's fine. Um, I didn't realize, maybe I did at one point, but you had this background of activism in your home that kind of primed you for the Catholic worker, in the sense that, like,
Yeah.
your mom was very passionately anti-war, and that's a wonderful kind of formation,
Yeah.
that I think is really neat. Um, some of us might come to these things in a different way,
Mm-hmm.
almost in reaction to our upbringing, but
Mm-hmm.
you kind of had that tradition, and I've heard you say before, the arguing with your teachers and stuff, and I really love that. I mean, it shows that you were already, concerned about what true spirituality is and what it means to, like, live out
Mm-hmm.
the way of Jesus. And so, yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Um,
And also, one other thing I wanted to say, my brain's going in a million directions. One of the other big things that I think the Berrigans, Dan, Phil, and then Liz's take on governments and empire today is that even since prophetic times, and even more so now, that we have to understand that what empires do is idolatry. So they require worship and sacrifice, and they require us to do exactly the opposite of what Jesus told us. You don't look for the soul and spirit, and not every being is made in the image and likeness of Christ. They have to sort of make it so that we're always ready to view everyone as the enemy and then kill them. And so the understanding is that when you understand that empire means idolatry, the sacrifice that we make because we're being idolatrous and breaking our real covenant with God, is the consequences of that are always violence and death. And
mm,
so, especially I'm thinking today of what's going on in Palestine.
yeah,
These are the realities of our faith, and they kind of are. There's a couple. Liz, I was blessed to spend lots of time with Liz, and she had a great thing about saying that how the churches today, instead of calling empire to judgment like we're supposed to be doing, what happens is the churches are deafening with their conniving silence. And so when you think about what's not being said in our pulpits and in front of our churches and to our congregations, really is a deafening silence, I find.
deafening with conniving silence. What a phrase! Wow.
Right? Right?
Um, I often think of, like, Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount, when he says that, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you.
Yeah.
If, like, obviously this doesn't work really with empire, but I think if we could require that of anybody who was served in the military, is that
Mm-hmm.
before they went out to kill the enemy, they had to pray for them. We might not be such a war hawkish nation, but
Right. And I mean, that's
yeah,
part of what empires do. They
yeah,
train us when, the military training. they break you down and then they reform you, but they take away that part where you should be believing that everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. Because if
Yeah.
you believe that, you couldn't kill other people like that in the
Yeah.
mass civilian death way that we do now.
Yeah. I mean, the way that it works is you have to dehumanize the enemy, or
Yeah.
at least not think of their humanity.
Yeah.
Like put it out of your head so that you mentally and psychologically can deal with the the carnage that you're participating in.
Yeah.
I never served in the military, so
Yeah.
I and have always kind of been against that, even before I could, frame it in the bigger thing. I never wanted to kill anybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I remember when I was 18 and you talk with the military recruiters and they're telling me all the wonderful things I could get by joining the military. And this recruiter is like telling me stuff. And I said, well, I don't want to be in the military. And he said, well, why? I was like, well, I don't want to kill anyone. He's like, well, I'm in the military. I've never killed anyone. I'm like, I kind of think that you have to be prepared to.
Yeah.
And that was a time of peace, and it was,
Yeah.
Peace, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was obviously U.S. military intervention over the last decades, but there was no war at that time, and so it would be possible to be in the military and not be directly involved in violence. But even then, like, had I joined up, it wasn't that long after that, September 11th happened, and anybody that was involved would kind of be brought back into the fold, so to speak, to do horrible things around the world. So it's just this whole thing. And plus, as you said, there is a formational aspect that, part of basic training is to break you down so that they can fashion you into something else. So.
Yes. And then you make your covenant with them and with empire.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. There's a lot there, Jackie. Wow.
We kind of jumped into the heavy, deep, and real kind of quick, though.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. That's fine. The deep end is kind of more fun in a way. I mean, the shallow end, you kind of get in your feet wet, but you can't dive in without hurting yourself. So you met the Berrigans, but how did you get involved with the Hartford Worker?
Well, interestingly enough, I had gotten arrested for the first time at Electric Boat Shipyard. That's in my neighborhood, and that makes the Trident and now the Columbia submarines. And I was 21, and I had gotten arrested with 250 other people at this mass demonstration. And when I went, they took us to the holding cells, and I met these two women from New York City that were Catholic workers. And I was like, what is that? And I was astonished and delighted to discover the Catholic worker movement, because there wasn't a Catholic worker house in Connecticut. And so that was my first introduction to the Catholic worker. And in my 20s, I spent a lot of time in the peace movement, traveling from DC up to Syracuse along the East Coast, doing a lot of actions and resistance work, and got to meet and stay with lots of different Catholic workers. And then I met my husband, Chris, at the Worcester Catholic Worker. And so when we got married, we decided to start a house in Hartford, where I had grown up.
Oh, so you started the Hartford Worker?
Yeah.
Wow.
Me and Chris and our housemate Brian. Yep.
Can I ask, just you in your 20s, because when this is all kind of starting, what decade are we in? Is that
we are in the 80s. So
80s.
I was born in 61. So I graduated from high school in 79. So in the 80s, this was all happening.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, there was a number of protests in terms of what Reagan was doing. So
right, and the Euro missiles, the Pershing missiles were being sent all over Europe, and there was a lot of the women were organizing at Seneca. There was a lot of stuff going on in the peace movement at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and U.S. intervention in South America and places that were
Right.
kind of off.
That's the other thing I could mention is that growing up, I had a sister that was a Maryknoll missioner, lay missioner. And
Wow.
so our family sort of received a lot of international news about the world through the lens of Maryknoll, which was a really excellent way to know what was actually going on in the world through the lens of faith and the lens of people ministering in other countries and always taking the side of the oppressed. So always getting sort of that vantage and viewpoint. And I realized how blessed I am for having that in my life as well. I think that was a big part of my young spiritual formation as well.
Wow, that's really neat. I mean, I sort of discovered that stuff later,
Mhm.
but it is to have kind of that insight um, in terms of how people on the margins were experiencing empire. Um,
Yeah.
because there are a lot of ways that there are blinders up that we don't really look at these things. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is kind of a great segue into what we're
Art.
talking about. Well, I mean, we're in this age that the world is broken. I wouldn't say uniquely broken. We've always been broken, but we are inundated almost daily with news of the next mass shooting, um, outbreaks of political, sexual, racial violence.
Mhm.
And of course, as you mentioned, there's the situation with between Gaza and Israel.
Mhm.
There's other wars in the world.
Mhm.
Ukraine and Russia is the other one that we're told as Americans to care about, but there's certainly violence everywhere.
Right.
Um, there's food insecurity, injustice in policing and our criminal justice system, and failure of society to care for vulnerable people, in America and around the world. And I think that our common response as people, maybe not your response, but as kind of the general response is to look away, to pretend you don't see it, or to distract yourself with like a Netflix binge or something, so that you don't have to think too
Yeah.
hard about how everything is awry. But as an artist and an activist, I mean, you're committed to looking at the world, right?
Right.
So what does it mean for us to not look away from these things?
Well, in some ways, I think the discipline of living in a Catholic worker house is helpful because you're not allowed to look away when you're submerged and living in what happens when a country spends $886 billion on military spending and barely anything to meet the human needs of the people in its community. So I think if you live in California, places like California and Texas, where there are huge encampments of homeless people, it's getting harder and harder to look away. But I also feel like there's two sides to that. I'm kind of anti-binary. Living in the north end of Hartford, I think I was 17 and I had done an errand for my mom, grew up in Hartford, spent my whole life there, and found a place in Hartford where I was completely lost, had no idea where I was, took me an hour to get out of there. When I came home, I said, how could there be this whole part of Hartford that I didn't even know existed? And my mom said, because we live in a really segregated, racist society. And so there are the hard, brutal things about living and working in the north end of Hartford, but it's a place of incredible blessings and incredible beauty, incredible community. And so I think not looking away, I think wholeness is something that God wants for us. So when you don't look away and you look at the whole picture and you look at the horrible and the beautiful and together and accept it, it gives you it gives your soul some sort of balance and healing that lets you go at the bad parts. And I like to think of art as sort of one of my as my favorite tool. So I do art with little kids all the time in our after school and Saturday program, and I think they find art very healing. And I also find the source in that experience to look at the world not as how it is, but as how God wants it to be.
Mm,
So, one of the founders of the Catholic Worker, Peter Morin, talks about communities, building these beloved communities that make it easier for people to go about doing good. So that's what I feel like. I also have that same sense of that's what my art is for, is not necessarily for it to be beautiful, but for it to show people, point people towards what is beautiful and soulful and good, if that makes sense.
that is, yes, it does, and I think that that's really really key. And I think, my own experience when I was in my 20s was my when I did intentional community. I did a kind of a couple of years in Atlanta and Miami, where lived in community with other Christians, and were involved in kind of neighborhood outreach and kind of at-risk neighborhoods, we would call them. But that what I quickly discovered was that when it's framed for you by empire, these are places that are blights. um,
Yeah.
but when you're linking hands with neighbors, and yes, they have problems. Yes, there's issues that they have to deal with, violence, drugs, whatever.
Yeah.
There's also this wonderful spirit and kind of good humans that are there, that really care about things, that kind of get dismissed by the narratives that we're fed.
Right. And that there's lots of violence, drugs, and all that other stuff in middle class and wealthy
Sure.
communities. They're just covered up very nicely by all the accoutrements, and they're not covered very well by the media. So that's another, like, being able to sort of dispel the myth
Yeah.
of
So
the ghetto or the inner city, and also to dispel the myth that these things just happened. When we love to tell, we have lots of middle class white or wealthier people that come to make community with us, and we have to kind of break down that thing where you're coming to serve and to help. No,
yeah,
you're
yeah,
coming
yeah,
to build relationship, make right relationships out of what's been institutionalized racism and poverty. You're coming to make amends and to work towards creating right relationships, and to acknowledge you have a burning need that the people here can help in healing you. And hopefully you can bring some gifts and be able to do, have a good, right, reciprocal relationship. So
yeah.
that's all stuff that you don't get through I guess I look at it as more of a justice than charity way,
Yeah, yeah,
way of looking and taking it apart. So, and that only comes, I mean, when I first started, I think I had a very different way of looking at it. But I think after 30 years, the neighborhood teaches you. So I feel like I've been taught a lot by our neighbors and by the community of folks that surround us. Thank God for them, because
yeah, yeah.
they really have made me whole.
I
Yeah.
would say with that, like, I mean, I totally agree with you that I think charity sometimes is this inoculation against caring for people,
And
because
it makes you feel good. It's charities for you.
yeah,
Justice is
yeah.
something you do for other people. Yeah.
My involvement with the programs I went with totally was probably fueled by this, like, idealized view of the
Yeah.
poor, and also the white savior complex.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you confront yourself in that moment and hopefully change.
Yeah.
And
For
I
sure.
think there were transformative things for me, and I one of my jobs was working with homeless people. And it'd be interesting, like, I'd have groups come in where they would, like, well, the reason why they're homeless is because they're on drugs or mentally ill. And I'm like, you know what, most of the people on drugs and most of the mentally ill people that are not homeless.
Right.
There is a more complicated issue here.
Right. Yeah.
These are
Yeah.
people without a network, and
Right.
and society has abandoned them or piled on them, or in some cases are against them. And so what are we going to do that is different than
Right.
that experience? What would it mean to to include these people in a network of care that is
And
different.
rehumanize them. It's the
Yeah,
same thing the military does. We dehumanize homeless people so we can call them homeless people instead of unhoused people, and so we can, make it real clear that they're real different from us or that they're the problem. And that's a hard go. That's a
yeah,
hard go.
yeah. I saw a cartoon. It keeps coming up in my feed, but of a couple of like people in a boardroom talking, and they're like, "Well, what are some of your anti-homeless um, ideas for architecture uh, and spitballing ideas?" It's like handles on benches so that they homeless people
Right.
can't lay down,
Right.
spikes everywhere, and then one of the guys says, "How about building homes?"
Right.
And they threw him out the window. Um,
I'm sure. And he landed on a spike on a bench.
right. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So you're holding both sides of that.
Mhm.
Is that um, when we talk about art and activism, we're talking about looking at the world as it is and not looking away. And then, as you also said, looking at the world of what could be,
Right.
particularly in the Christian sense.
Hmm.
What would it look like to bring the kingdom of God where we are? And we're in this season of Advent where, again, like hope is a thing.
Hmm.
Advent works on these two levels. If we look back at the Christian story of Jesus coming and what that meant in terms of first century Israel, but
Hmm.
also what does it mean to welcome Jesus now, and what does it mean to live as though Jesus is King and the reign of God is here. So um, I have a quote. I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to read it anyway. This is Kandinsky. Kandinsky.
Mm. Mm.
So he's got a book called "The Concerning the Spiritual in Art," and I this is right in his introduction, but I love it. The spiritual life to which art belongs, and of which she is one of the mightiest elements, is a complicated but definite and easily definable movement forwards and upwards. This movement is the movement of experience. It may take different forms, but it holds at bottom to the same inner thought and purpose. And so I was just thinking in the terms of art and activism, is this movement forward and upward? I don't know. I'm going to throw that out there. What does it mean for us to hold out hope and create hopeful visions of the world?
I guess for me, it means bringing people together to create art and then to take their art and do something active with it. So I know, my Catholic school upbringing, no art classes, no art department. So when I went to college, I only lasted a year and a half, but when I went to college, I really wanted to take art, but I couldn't do it because I didn't had never taken painting classes and this and that. And so I kind of, when I dropped out of college, didn't really do art and felt like I was an art failure until my mom asked me to make some banners for a Pax Christi march. And I made them and people went crazy over them. So I started making a lot of banners. So doing that kind of art is what sort of brought my art spark back to life. And one of my favorite things to do is to do art builds with people before demonstrations. I was really blessed to go to Bread and Puppet Theater for a summer and study with Peter Schumann and learn how to make giant paper mache puppets.
Oh, wow.
Um, so I've loved doing that with folks, building giant puppets for protests. We have a big Uncle Sam skeleton that has a big hat, and we had a mourning mother that unfortunately giant, probably 20-foot tall mourning mother puppet that we used a lot, during Iraq and Afghanistan and after 9/11 and the sanctions in Iraq. And um, so I guess I feel like calling, we're using the art in a way that is condemning or crying out about something that's wrong and desolate, but then we're also using words and quotes and art to inspire people about what really keeps us secure and safe. And that's community and taking care of our brothers and sisters. And when you think about it, we do have a real poverty of imagination about what we could have in this country if we weren't spending $400 billion a year on weapons. Think of what we could have and the resources, what we could do with those resources. I do feel like there's a poverty of imagination. So whenever we do use our art and banners at a protest, we always talk about the human cost, the money cost, and then what we would like to do instead.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's one thing that makes me feel hopeful. And it's hard. Like, what can people who love justice and despise war and killing and civilian death, what can people do? And for me, one of the things I can do is make a banner, is make art that talks about torture victims and includes their poetry, that rehumanizes our brothers and sisters. So I guess that's the kind of art that really speaks to me.
Yeah.
Art that makes people ask questions, why are these people here? We had in November, we shut down Electric Boat Shipyard at 2 gates because we had these giant 25 feet banners, and we had a big ceasefire banners, and an artist and friend of mine and I, we had painted this huge burnt city scene on the bottom of the words ceasefire, and people going by want to know what that means. What's that about?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Is that answering the question about hopefulness? I guess I feel like what I'm trying to say is, for me, hope has to be attached to action. Hope
Yeah.
can't just be, oh, I really hope something better happens. I hope the world can change. I hope, kind of hope. Phil Bergen used to say, your hope is where your ass is. So if you're sitting in a chair, your hope's in a chair. If you have to do something with your hope that points to what you want, what you're hopeful about, and that points to the way you're going to get it. So I don't know. It's a very hard time to be hopeful. I'll be honest about that. But I also feel like for Christians, for us, our whole theology is based on the belief that when something dies, something more powerful is born.
Yeah.
So
Can you say that again? Say that again.
Well, I think our whole theology is based on when something dies, something more powerful is born. And I mean that in terms of the life of Christ, but I also mean that in terms of, for Catholics, the martyrs and the saints are the seeds of the church. So,
Right.
The apostles, most of them died horribly, but their blood and their death became the seeds of the Christian communities and Christian life and Christ's message continuing through the years. So I think hope isn't always pretty and beautiful and lovely, but it means that you really believe, no matter how dark it is, that darkness will never overcome the light, and that you have to live in the light and fight for the light. And that's what keeps the light going. So I guess it goes back to that sort of choosing your covenant. Is your covenant be with the God of light, or is your covenant going to be with consumerism and empire and, planet death and all the things that come along with that? And I also feel like one is very fear-based and one is very faith-based. So another thing Liz McAllister used to say all the time is the opposite of fear is not courage. The opposite of fear is faith. And I think that's really important. We live in such a fear-based culture. Everybody's got to have a gun. We got to be armed to the teeth to the death of the world. And that all comes from having security in something that is not God. Dan Berrigan used to say, security, security, the plain chant of the damned, really, and I guess I feel like our lives are our art. I work really hard at not separating my art from the other parts of my life. And sometimes I need to just make a beautiful pastel landscape that is filled with trees and ocean and light. And sometimes I need to make a horrible banner with starving children being covered over by their mother's arms, like Kata Kolowitz. But I feel like all of the things that art and poetry and music and theater and dance bring to us is about building community. And a lot of stuff that empire requires of us is about destroying community. So for me, I want to live in that light and live in that hope and basically keep on resisting because I think there's a lot of hope going on. Like what I see happening in Gaza is horrific and it's clearly genocide. But
Yeah.
I also see a global resurgence of resistance to that we have not seen since, I think, since the Iraq War started in the peace movement and across the world. And what I see happening in the movement now that's beautiful and different is the diversity, the inclusion and recognition of how Indigenous people have been screwed and slaughtered from the very beginning. I see a welcoming of people that are trans and gay and lesbian, and I think that's a huge thing. I see religions taking hands with each other, and those are the kind of things that really, really give me hope. And I'm happy to be a part of that movement. So, and that's in the face of, $114 billion being spent in my state for 12 new nuclear submarines that we already have 14. Why do we need 12 more? It's horrible.
Mm.
So, yeah.
When we look specifically, just because we're talking about Israel and Palestine. What is your hope for that conflict?
Well, that's the hardest place to be hopeful at all because basically, I mean, the Palestinians are just being slaughtered
Mm.
and removed from the earth. And I don't know how you have hope in that. Um,
Yeah.
I really don't. I mean, I've spent some time in jail for recently because of that, and nothing you can do is enough.
Right.
I
And it is this
I
interest.
don't know. All I can say is that level of slaughter, like to me, that level of slaughter is the logical conclusion of a government based on military oppression that is allowed to completely disregard the humanity of a whole group of people, which most governments do and have done. Our government is no exception to that.
Right.
We did it with indigenous people and people of color and slavery and genocide. And now it's happening. I think the difference is it's happening on people's Instagram and Facebook pages. You're seeing it live. And I don't know how we live with ourselves. And I don't know what could possibly be hopeful about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unless it's people saying no to it and doing something, coming together to do things about it. And even that is yeah, I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah.
It's such a sin. I can't even comprehend. Yeah.
There's a lot of background to that. Like we talk about the scripts we're given.
Yeah. And of course, supposedly it's two governments going at each other. I mean, it's like David and Goliath, but it's it's the logical conclusion of how militarized governments believe that they're right and someone else is completely wrong, and they will take you to the very end of everything to prove it and be the winner and get it.
Mm.
And it's the antithesis of creation and of God's spirit in everyone. And it's absolutely horrific. I hate to say it, but I
Yeah.
just don't understand how it keeps going on every day.
I was struck. I was just thinking, Daniel Berrigan, probably most famous for most people for the Catonsville Nine, but he was theatrical.
Yeah.
That a lot of the actions that he connived, planned, were theater, including
Symbolic.
the Catonsville Nine. I mean, he wrote a play about it later, and he was a poet and a prophet and an exegete. But one of the things that I always remember is where he apologizes for
The burning of paper instead of children.
Yeah, upsetting the order by burning paper instead of children. And there is there is an unmasking that happens when in that performance, because they're like, oh yeah, I mean, burning of draft cards
Right.
instead of napalm used by American military against civilian populations in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Um, and and this is kind of what your banners do, and the protests that we're talking about is what does it look like to unmask the evil that is there. um,
Right.
and
Right.
there's all kinds of kind of our complicity with the Israel Palestinian affair. I mean, obviously there's Zionism, which predates the the formation of Israel. Um,
Yeah.
but
And there's also so much unhealed trauma
yeah,
from the Holocaust. So I don't know
right,
if you
yeah,
listened to Gabor Mate, but he has said wonderful as a Jewish person who lost family in the Holocaust. He has said a lot of amazing things about what's happening now is is untreated trauma from the Holocaust is now causing the trauma that the Palestinians are suffering and the cycle of violence that it creates. So when we look at our country, I mean, at the Catholic Worker, we serve tons of vets. They come for food, they come for socks and hats, and
mhm,
they come to get their feet fixed. Um, there's so much unhealed trauma from war, and the unhealed trauma continues to prep the stage and prep the way for the next layer of war, for the next group of people that are willing to, you know, put that suffering out onto other people. So it's very hard. And, yeah, I'm a firm believer you have to pray constantly everywhere. I never go by the gate of Electric Boat without saying a prayer to the Holy Spirit. I never can go by a prison without putting my hand up and saying a prayer for the people inside and the people that have to spend 40 hours a week guarding the people inside.
mm,
I think the way the world is now requires constant prayer. I can't even look on Instagram because it's so debilitating to me. And it makes me want to go do a blood pouring at the federal building. And,
mm.
that's part of the liturgical, sacramental, Berrigan
Yeah, yeah. So
symbolic
I
liturgy.
I know what that is, but can you say what a blood pouring would be? What it involves?
Well, it certainly has changed over time. Originally, with the plowshares actions, one of the things that would happen is you would go nonviolently to a weapons site where weapons, first strike nuclear weapons, were being made, and bring an indictment and a banner and a baby bottle with your own blood in it and pour it over the weapon or mark the weapon because we are really good at not seeing the effects of the things we create and pay for and build. So for a B-52 bomber to be splashed with a baby bottle full of blood will show you what the result is when those bomb bay doors open.
Mm,
So that's sort of and I think it's got a scriptural tradition from when houses were marked with blood to spare the innocent children. So I think it's sort of one of those ways that you use this sort of theater and art to make things visible that people want to be hidden.
yeah.
So I know in the beginning of the Gulf War, when my husband was making trips to bring medicine and food to Iraq, where 500, 500,000 children had starved to death during our sanctions. My husband went a number of times back and forth to Iraq and led delegations and brought, news people. And one of the things we did at home was we would go to the federal building with big, huge blown up posters and banners made with children, the faces of children with their arms and legs blown off, a lot of things that you're seeing from Palestine. And we would blockade the doors and we would pour blood across the front of the building. And we would say, you don't have to look at this here in Hartford, but here's what it looks like in this little city in Iraq that we're doing. This is what we're doing because we weren't seeing it. It's not on the news,
Yeah.
you know. So I just sort of, I guess that sort of ties in with the idea of art and theater. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, and this idea of I think unmasking, letting people see reality, and
right. And to be really clear and say, not in my name.
Hmm.
So when I go down to Electric Boat with my ceasefire, because Trident submarines were sent over to Gaza to float outside there and let people know, oh, don't take the side of the Palestinians, or because here's our submarine. I could very clearly say, as the policeman was putting me in the car and was telling me he was in the Air Force and nuclear weapons are totally safe, and I just could say, hey, this is not happening in my name, not in my name. And I don't know a stronger way to do that,
Hmm.
and to keep doing it, I guess, until we
So,
do get the effect that we hope for, which is to say a world where children can live in peace without being bombed to death or starved to death because of what their governments want.
right. I'm going to ask a question here because I also know that a lot of people who are involved in the type of work that you do kind of get burned out,
Yeah,
um, because
yeah.
it is heavy. Um, when you consider the injustice that our government has perpetuated, and it doesn't seem like things change very quickly.
Mm.
What is it that you do, Jackie, that nourishes your spirit so that you can continue the work?
Huh. Well, actually, believe it or not, because I do have a big mouth and love to talk, silence has become one of the best ways I can refill my well. So I try to do, with my sister Terry sometimes, I try to do 20-minute silent meditation in the morning to start the day. That's a huge thing. I also make sure I walk every day with my dog somewhere in nature, either by the water, by the ocean, or in some trees somewhere if I'm in Hartford at Keeney Park, or um, so I think nature is very healing. Silence is very healing to me. I have a very high need for joy, so I find the need to be around people and have fun and do fun things. So I really enjoy painting with the kids at the Catholic Worker, and we've been working on little pictures, paintings for them to give their moms and grandmas for Christmas. I love music, so I listen to music all the time. I have a really weird eclectic spirit playlist. I also think every single song almost is about God, like Chrissy Hine and the Pretenders. I'll stand by you. That's a song about God and us. I can make anything be about God. But so music is something I love art. I love looking at art. I love other people's art. I love going to museums. It's hard. You got to find a balance, self-care versus care out in the others. And I have been very bad about that in the past. So I have gotten burned out and had issues, but I'm trying to have a better balance now.
Hmm.
I like to make time to have a date night with my husband and do something completely separate from all of the hard, harsh realities of the world we live in and be escapist. Um, I dread protests, but once I'm at them, I love them and they're so energizing and they give me energy and
Hmm.
they make me very happy. I'm blessed to be part of a group called the Atlantic Life Community. It's tons of Catholic workers, but it's all peace people up and down the East Coast. And we try to do actions together. And that always involves banner making and eating food together and, planning and meeting and praying and I'm very grateful and blessed. I try to do gratitudes when I have my desolations. I try to make sure I have just as many consolations.
Hmm.
So I really do a lot of praying and gratitude prayers to my peacemaking ancestors and the Berrigans, folks that are not here but are still here with us and still give us a portion of their spirit. So I would say those are some of the things that keep the well filled up, as they say.
Wonderful, wonderful. Is there somewhere, if somebody wanted to connect with you and your work, that I can point them to online, or you can point them to? Or-
Sure. We have the Catholic Worker has a website, a web page. You can write to us through that. It's hartfordcatholicworker.org.
Mhm.
And I have a Facebook page. I actually have two. One is supposed to be for my art, but I hardly ever go on it. But I do get messages from it. And then there's just Jackie Allen-Ducot, if someone wanted to reach out. And I would say everyone, especially young people, go visit a Catholic worker house, because we're always looking for interns and community members. And it's a really joyful, great, I mean, community can be hell. Anyone that's ever lived in community knows. I have a theory that Jesus wanted the apostles to live in community because they would be so busy dealing with each other. They would never try to take over the world or become masters of empire. And but visit a community and look at what it's like to be able to live a life that makes room for art and resistance and hope and sacrament and liturgy and all that good stuff that our souls long for.
Oh, well, thank you, Jackie. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I love that I got to spend some time with you. It's been a while.
It has been a while, so let's do it again.
All right.
Maybe not in the podcast form, so I'm not stressed out.
Of course. Yeah. That was a wonderful conversation for me. I really got a lot out of hearing what Jackie was doing, her perspective on the world, and what it means to inhabit this covenant with the Spirit instead of the covenant with empire. Walter Burghardt, who is a Jesuit priest, is famous for saying that contemplation is taking a long, loving look at the real. And I think that typifies what Jackie said today. Is she taking a long, loving look at the real in her prayer life, in her life as an artist, and the way that she does art in community and for communities, and in her activism. Sometimes the weightiness of the world feels too real, but the reality is that another world is possible. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast. And until next time, keep practicing.